Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf. Hey, we begin with the Mishnah, which introduces us to the subject of what is bread. Now, there are three basic halachas that we need to know what bread is. First of all, you can make matzah out of it and be fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. Second of all, it becomes chametz, and if you eat it at any time during Pesach, it's an Isser D'Oraisa, which brings kares or a carbon if it's done by accident. And the third halacha is that you have to take challah from it. And Mishnah will discuss a number of different types of grain that qualify for making bread, and we'll see different statuses of the breads halachically, different halachic statusi that apply. The Gemara will get into other factors such as how you eat it and what type of liquid it's mixed with and how it's kneaded and things like that. So first of all, the Mishnah lists 5 grains which can make bread. They are wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. And now the halachos. So if it's demai, bread which is demai, that means that it was bought from an amartz. You don't know if he took off meiser or not, and you're supposed to re-meiser it out of doubt, but you didn't. That's demai. You do fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach with that. Meiser rishon, meaning meiser which was given to the Levi, that he took trumas meiser from it, that also works. The Gemara will explain why you would think not. Meiser sheni, something which is meiser sheni, which has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, which was brought to Yerushalayim and it was redeemed, and it's not meiser sheni anymore. Or hektish, which was given to hektish and it was redeemed. Those you could also use for the mitzvah of matzah. The Gemara will explain why that's a chiddush. Challah and truma are only allowed to be eaten by kohanim. Kohanim are allowed to use them for the mitzvah of matzah. Tevel, which did not have truma or meiser taken off it, you cannot. Meiser rishon, which was given to the Levi that he did not take truma from. Meiser sheni, that's outside Yerushalayim that you didn't redeem. Hektish, that wasn't redeemed. You can't use any of that. Now, what about breads made to go with karbonos? Like the carbon of toida, which has matzahs to go along with it, and the carbon of a nazir, which has matzahs to go along with that. So here it depends why you made them. If you made them to sell to a person to bring in a carbon toida and a carbon nazir, then you can use them. If, however, you made them to use yourself for your own karbonos, then you cannot use them for the mitzvah of matzah. Okay, the Gemara now begins. The Gemara first of all defines what these types of grain are, and the Gemara says there are 2 categories. Wheat and spelt are the same category, and the other 3 are all types of barley. You got the barley, oats, and rye. Those are all from the barley family. This is important to know because you can take truma from one on the other. You're only allowed to take truma from one min on its own min. You can't take from oats and barley and things like that. You can't take from wheat on barley and things like that, but these 2 categories are all considered families of grain. Now the Gemara defines these to some extent. The Gemara says kusmin, that's spelled, is gulba. Shifon, which is rye, is called dishra, and shibal shuel is called shivile tawa. Different names for these grains which the Gemara identifies. Now the Gemara says we left out 2 grains, and those are orez and dochen. Not clear what these grains are. Various translations have rice, millet, or buckwheat. But these are left off the list, so apparently you cannot use these to make matzah. The Gemara says, what is the source? So the Gemara brings that Rish Lakish brings, and Rabbi Shmuel brings a brisa, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov brings a brisa that we link the mitzvah of matzah and the use of eating chametz. Whatever grain works for matzah works for chametz. Whatever grain is not chametz can't be used for matzah. And this type of grain doesn't make chametz. It doesn't become... it does not rise. It does not have the same process happen to it. If you make flour out of orez or dochen and you put in yeast, it just gets rotten and spoils. It doesn't rise and become nice fluffy bread. Therefore, it doesn't really have a chametz process, and therefore it doesn't really qualify as matzah. Marcus Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri disagrees. He says that orez you could use. Orez is bread, and when it becomes chametz, it's real chametz. You eat it on Pesach, you get kares. The Gemara quotes the brisa where he says that. The Gemara notes that his language is different. It says that it's karoiv lahachmetz. It's close to becoming chametz. What does that mean? Karoiv lahachmetz means that it becomes chametz quickly. It goes through the fermentation process quickly, or does that mean that it's almost chametz but it's not real chametz and therefore it would only be aser d'Rabbanan? So the Gemara says, we have a brisa where Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri clearly says if you eat chametz made out of rice or whatever orez is translated as, if you eat that on Pesach on purpose, you get kares. By accident, you have to bring a carbon, so it's clearly chametz d'oraisa. And when the word kar lachmetz means that it is machmetz faster, it ferments quicker. It doesn't mean to say that it's almost chametz. Now, Nuri also holds that a vegetable called karmis, it qualifies for hilchos challah. You got to take challah from that, and that also therefore means that it also can be used for matzah and chametz. What's karmis? Abaye calls it shitznisa. What's that? Papa explains it's a type of herb which grows in fields of grain, or it grows in fields of poppy seeds. Now the Gemara moves on to discuss matzah or chametz, which is made with other liquids. So the Gemara quotes Rish Lakish, who says that if the only liquid involved is wine or oil or honey, there's no water, then it's not real chametz. So the Gemara says that Rav Papa and Rav Huna Rav Yeshua were sitting in front of Rav Yidi Bar Avin, and Rav Yidi Bar Avin was falling asleep, and so Rav Huna Rav Yeshua asked Rav Papa, what's Rish Lakish's reasoning? Rav Papa said, because since you can't use it for matzah, you can't use it, or it does not qualify as chametz. How do you know you can't use it for matzah? Matzah is called lechem oini, poor man's bread. If there's no water in it, it's made with these sweet juices, then it's rich man's bread. Since it's no good for matzah, it's no good for chametz. So Gemara says, he asked him, but I'll bring an example of something where you see that the halacha of chametz and matzah do not apply. You have something which is chametz, even though it doesn't count as matzah. What's that? If somebody soaks his matzah in water and swallows it in one shot instead of chewing it up and eating it normally, then he violates the issur of kares. He has to bring a carbon or he gets kares. He violates the issur of chametz. But as far as eating matzah, you can't get the mitzvah of matzah that way. So you see that they're not connected, they're not related. As was happening, Rav Yidi Bar Avin woke up and he said, children, the reason of Rish Lakish's halacha is because fruit juice does not cause fermentation. It doesn't chametz. It doesn't ferment, and it doesn't make real chametz. Nothing to do with the halacha of learning, connecting matzah and chametz. The Gemara now proceeds to work through each of the halachas in the Mishnah, showing why each line and each halacha is a chiddush, and it is true. So first of all, the Mishnah said that you're allowed to use demai for matzah on Pesach. The Gemara asks, why should you be allowed to use demai? You're not allowed to eat demai. You are eating something which you're not allowed to eat. It's a mitzvah b'avera, and in addition, we'll see later that you can't use something which has an isser. You can't use that for matzah. There's a special gzeres hakasa for that. So Gemara says this is different. Demai is permitted to a poor person, and it's permitted to soldiers that are quartering in somebody's house, who are also considered to be poor people. Therefore, you technically have access to it. You can make all your property hefker, and then you'll become a poor person, and therefore you'll be allowed to eat demai. Since you could theoretically make yourself fit to be demai, to be able to eat demai, and since demai is only an issur d'Rabbanan anyway, the Rabbanan gave this dispensation. And since you could have access to it, you could therefore use it for matzah. That doesn't mean that you're not violating the issur d'Rabbanan when you use it, but it does at least be mekayim. It fulfills the mitzvah d'oraisa of eating matzah. The Gemara quotes a machlokes beisel and meishamai as to whether or not you're allowed to feed demai to the poor and to the soldiers. The Gemara says we don't paskin like meishamai. He says you can't. We paskin that you could. Okay, next, the Mishnah said in the first half that you're allowed to use grain that truma was taken off. You're not allowed to use grain that truma was not taken off. So the Gemara says, well, first of all, it's obvious. If truma was taken off, if it's meiser that truma was taken off, what's the problem? It's perfectly fine. Everything's done right. And later, the Gemara will ask, if truma was not taken off, then for sure it's a problem. It's asar. So Gemara says the case here is where the meiser, when we say that it's meiser, that truma was taken off, we don't mean that the trumas, the truma gidola, the first meiser was taken off. We don't mean that it was done properly. What's supposed to happen is when the Yisrael harvests his grain, as soon as it becomes heaped and processed and it's ready for a truma and a meiser, he's supposed to take off truma and give it to the kohen. Then he's supposed to give meiser to the Levi, and the Levi is supposed to give trumas meiser. Here what happened is that the Levi skipped. He jumped ahead of the truma gedola given to the Kohen. He ran and he took his meiser first. That means that the grain that he has never had truma gedola taken from it. He then has to go ahead and give trumas meiser. So that the Mishnah says that's what the Mishnah was referring to when it said that it's meiser in which trumas meiser was given. But what happened here is that Truma Gedel was never given from this. So the halacha is that that's okay. You're allowed to use that, and the reason is because there's a pasuk that says he's supposed to give Truma Trumas Meiser from your Meiser, you're not supposed to give Truma Gedola from your Meiser. If you got the Meiser before Truma Gedola was taken off, you don't have to give Truma Gedola afterwards. So Gemara now differentiates, and the Gemara says this is only if the Levi took it before it was ever chayav in Truma Gedola in the first place. He grabbed it while it was still in the stalks. If he grabbed it once it was heaped in a pile and it was processed and it was grain, then he does have to give it. And that's the two halves of the Mishnah. The first half of the Mishnah is saying that where it was in the stalks when he grabbed it, he doesn't have to give it, and therefore he could use it for matzah. And the second half where it says that he can't if Truma was not given is referring to where Truma Gedola wasn't given. He grabbed it before Truma Gedola was given, but he grabbed once it was already chayiv in Truma Gedola where it was already grain. Now the Gemara says, what's the difference between the two? So the Gemara says we have a pasuk that says, you should give. It says Mikol matnei seichem tarimu, from everything that you have, all your gifts, you should give Trumas Meiser. You should give Truma. Mikol maser seichem tarimu Trumas Hashem. You should give Truma. That's an extra pasuk that includes even where the Levi grabbed it first, you should give. Now that's referring to where the Levi grabbed it once it was already processed grain. There, it already has the halacha of grain. The phrase Mikol Digancha applies to that, and therefore you're chayiv. And therefore the extra limud, the pasuk that says you should give from all your truma, applies to that. However, in the situation where it was still in the stalks when the Levi grabbed it, there it was never considered grain. The halacha of Digancha, the pasuk which says that from your grain you should give, does not apply. And therefore, this pasuk of Mikol matnei seichem tarimu, it's called Trumas Hashem, which teaches me extra, that does not apply. Instead, we go with the other pasuk that says, you should give meiser from your meiser, you shouldn't give truma from your meiser. So, that's the difference between the two. That's why, when the Levi grabs from the stalks, we say you don't have to give the meiser, because it was never chayav yet, it's not considered grain yet, it's not the gancha. But if he grabs it from when it's already processed and it's already grain, then he does have to give the Truma Gedola that was never given before. Okay, further in the Mishnah, it says Meiser Sheni and Hekesh that was redeemed, you could use. Gemara says, of course, if it was redeemed properly, what's the problem? Gemara says, we're referring to where it was redeemed, but the extra fifth was not given. When you redeem Meiser Sheni at Truma, you're supposed to add a fifth of the value, which is really a fourth of the value. It's a fifth including the fifth. It's a fifth of the total value including what you're adding, which ends up being a fourth. So you didn't add that extra fifth. So that's not me'akiv. It does not block you from being able to use it. You're still allowed to use it, even though you didn't do what you're supposed to do. You did not give the fifth. Now we said Kehanim are allowed to use challah and truma. Gemara says you would have thought that you got to use something which is equally usable to all people, but you don't have to. And the source for that is there. It says matzahs a few times to learn extra types of matzah you could use, even ones which aren't fitting for everybody. Next, the Mishnah said you can't use tevel, and so the Mishnah says, of course you can't use tevel. What's the chiddush? The Mishnah says it's referring to tevel d'Rabbanan, where it was grown in a flower pot that didn't have a hole. It was only chayev in truma mid'Rabbanan, not mid'Oraisa. Okay. Now the Gemara moves on to you cannot use Meiser Sheni or Hekesh that was not redeemed. The Gemara says, of course not. It was redeemed. I should be able to use it. The Gemara says chiddush where it was redeemed but not properly. The Meiser Sheni was redeemed on a coin, meaning you transfer the kedusha from the Meiser Sheni to a coin that does not have a face. The halachas it says with tzarta kesef, it has to have a tzura from the word tzarta. It's got to be something with a face. If it doesn't have a face, it wasn't done properly. And hektish you're supposed to redeem on money. You're not supposed to redeem it on property, on real estate. If you transfer its kedusha onto real estate, you didn't do it correctly. Like it says, "V'nas on a kesef v'kamlai." That's a source that you shouldn't use real estate. You should give money, and it wasn't done properly, but it was properly enough for you to be able to use it for matzah. Okay, that's how we understand all the phrases in the Mishnah. Now the Gemara moves on to a related brisa, and the Gemara is going to interrupt it in the middle. The brisa says, "You may think that you're allowed to use matzah that is made from tevel that was not properly fixed." So I'm going to show you that you can't. The Gemara interrupts and says, hold on a second. Tevel, which wasn't fixed? Of course. The word tevel means grain that wasn't fixed. It did not have its meiser taken from it. It did not have its truma taken from it. What do you mean when you say tevel that wasn't fixed? So the Gemara says what it means is that it was tevel in some ways. It was fixed some ways, but not fully. Meaning, if, for example, you took off Truma Gedayla, but you didn't take off Trumas Meiser, or you didn't take off Meiser Rishon, or you didn't take off Meiser Sheni, or you didn't take off Meiser Ani, any of these things which wasn't taken is partial Tevel, not fully Tevel, but not fully permitted. And that's what we're asking about. Anyway, the Brisa continues and says, what is the source that you can't use that for matzah? So the Gemara says, the Pasuk says, L'sechel of chametz, you should not eat chametz with your carbon Pesach, you should eat matzah instead. You shouldn't eat chametz with your matzah. You shouldn't eat, meaning that matzah has an isser on it that it shouldn't be chametz. That's teaching me as follows. The matzah has to be something that the only isser that applies to it is if it would be chametz, it would be asr. It can't be that it's also for a different reason. Any other isser that applies to it, we learn from here, can't not qualify as matzah. The only mitzvah it should have is that it's not, the only isser it should be avoiding is chametz. Shouldn't be anything else involved. So if it's tevel, then you have another problem. It's tevel, it's not a problem of chametz. If you have something else that's asr for a different reason, then the isser of chametz doesn't apply. It's only an isser of tevel. So therefore, you can't use it for matzah. So the Gemara interrupts here. The Gemara says, "Hold on a second. You're telling me that if it's tevel, it's not chametz? Why should tevel not be chametz? It can be tevel and chametz." So Rav Shesha says, this must be Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon holds of a concept in Shas called ein isser chalal isser, something which is forbidden for one reason. You cannot apply a second forbidding reason on top of that. So if something is tevel already, meaning it's grain that did not have its meiser or truma, it's taken from it, it's forbidden to eat, the isser of chametz doesn't stick to it. And Rav Shimon says that we see that halacha. Rav Shimon says if somebody eats a nevela on Yom Kippur, so it was nevela before Yom Kippur, it was asr because of nevela. The fact that it became Yom Kippur doesn't stick on this thing. You didn't violate the isser Yom Kippur by eating nevela. You only violated the isser nevela. Now Ravina says another reason. Ravina says just read it differently. It doesn't mean to say that the isser chametz is gone. You only have one isser tevel. We're supposed to that we're sitting here trying to figure out what happened to the isser chametz. Ravina says no. It means that it has tevel and chametz. That's all it means to say. It doesn't have. It's supposed to have that in order to be able to use grain for matzah. It's supposed to have only an isser chametz. It's not supposed to have anything else. Now the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says it does not say something which only has chametz. It says something which has chametz, as opposed to this which does not have an isser chametz. So it seems to imply like that the first answer is the correct answer, that if you have that this Bryce is assuming that if you have an isser other than chametz that was there before, then the isser chametz does not stay.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.